Welcome to another edition of Talking Together. I'm Richard Sentner. With me today are Jeff Klein and Dianne Ashley. I want to thank you both for being here. The title of today's show is The Fateful Triangle and the Quest for Just Peace. Back in 1983, Noam Chomsky wrote this book called The Fateful Triangle, the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians. And that triangle he was talking about is very much alive and going today. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the possibilities for peace, and we're also going to talk about the impediments to it. So, Dianne, you want to start us off?
Well, I think that the topic was what we in the United States can do towards peace.
Okay.
And so I was just going to say all the things that I think we need to do. I think that we have been struggling against a political situation with President Obama and members of Congress that are not doing anything helpful. And I think that many of them know what the situation is, but they're not doing anything. So my approach is to work with the grassroots, to work educating the people and get them to try to move their Congress people to do more. And I have a lot of different ways to do that, but I think maybe we might want to talk more about the political situation.
Well, why don't you start off by telling us just a few of the ways that you think...
Okay. Well, there are a lot of good organizations that we need to support. WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and our committee is the West Asia Group, and then there's Code Pink, Jewish Voice for Peace, Mecca, If Americans Knew, Palestinian Chronicle. And I think that we have a conference on Cape Cod, the Tree of Life Conference, and a journey, the Tree of Life Journey, which goes to Israel and Palestine. And the conference, which is always in the fall, in October and November, brings people from Israel and Palestine over, and we try to get as many people as we can and educate them. And then during the year, we also have speakers. March 23rd, we had Maya Wind and Aaron Efrati speak in Orleans, and the Refused Nick and the Soldier, and that talk brought in a different audience than before. A very,
that's interesting.
Yeah, a very intelligent, reasonable, but skeptical Jewish audience. And they asked very good questions, and they seem to really have learned a lot from these two young people who are Jewish, grew up in Jerusalem, and one, Maya, 26, has refused to serve in the armed services. She refused 3 times, went to jail for 40 days each time, and went before the judges, the generals, trying to get a conscientious objector status, and was told political reasons are not good reasons for a conscientious objector status. And Aaron Efrati was a soldier. And after he got out, he joined Breaking the Silence and told some horrifying stories about what took place, especially in Hebron. So this kind of speaker seems to really change people.
I'm interested in the fact that you're able to attract an audience you don't normally attract, because I think that one of the problems that movements have is that you sort of speak to the choir. You know, when I lived in Dorchester for about 30 years, I must have gone to 10,000, symposiums and stuff, and I just saw the same people every time I went. There were the same people there, and it's just, I think it's a real problem. So the fact that you were able to attract people who don't normally show up at these things is just wonderful. I think that's what needs to happen. Okay,
yes, I agree, but I don't really know why we did this time.
Okay. Jeff?
And we didn't.
Well, it's an illustration of one of the difficulties of approaching this issue politically in the United States, is that most people don't care that much about it. And of those who care about it and know about it, there's a hardcore of pro-Israel sentiment that has a political expression that's very powerful in this country, and there's very little counterpart in the other direction that has political weight to have a U.S. policy that's different from the one it has now. And that's the sort of central political difficulty we have. You know, of the politically active class in this country, which is a minority, a small minority, actually, pro-Israel sentiment is much better organized and more influential than pro-peace sentiment in the Middle East. And until we figure out how to break through that, or how to sort of grasp the political nut in a different way, it's going to continue to sort of be this asymmetrical pro-Israel stance of our government. And you know, there's a lot of illustrations of that in our sort of some current political examples.
Right. Dianne, you want to jump in here?
Well, I agree with Jeff, and I agree with the problem is reaching people, and we do have a film series on Cape Cod, Channel 99, the local channel, where every Saturday, 4 to 5, we show 9 different films. One of them we made right here with Jeff. That was the first one. Remember that?
Yes.
I remember that.
And then we have one with Howard Zinn, and we also have the play, The Words of Rachel Corrie, but we've added 3 new ones, which are just made in the last few years. Budrus,
Yeah, why don't you hold that up?
about a town in the West Bank that was, they were building the wall, the security wall, so-called security wall or separation wall, right through this town, and the people organized peacefully. And finally, it was the women that finally won the battle to move the wall. It's a small battle just away from, just off of Palestinian land to the border between Israel and Palestine. That was the great victory that they had. But it's all about how many different ways they tried. And then The Land Speaks Arabic. I've been somewhat surprised at how many people, we've shown this also at First Parish Brewster, but it's also now on our our TV program, and it's about what happened in Israel and Palestine between 1945 and 1954. So it's all about the background.
Okay. As we go along, I want to talk a bit about this book by Rashid Khalidi called The Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Undermined Peace in the Middle East. I read it last night. My good friend John Amir gave this to me. And I want to explain to the audience a little bit about Rashid, because I think it's important. Back in the 2008 presidential campaign, he was demonized by both political parties, you know. But the truth is that this is one of the really, really good guys. And when Edward Said died, they created a chair in his name at Columbia, and Rashid is the man they picked to fill that chair. And this book of his is not really so much about what's happened to the Palestinian people. It really is about the U.S. It's about how the U.S. has been undermining any kind of just peace in the Middle East from the very beginning. And a lot of it has to do with language. You know, he begins with, and I want to read this, he begins with this quote from Orwell. And this is the quote from Orwell, from Orwell's the famous essay, Politics in the English Language. The slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should and do know better. And he spends a lot of time talking about the way in which language has been used right from the very beginning. You know, this whole business about the Jews as victims from the Holocaust and all that, that's been used against anybody who dared to criticize the state. And he's also talked about particular kinds of words and phrases that we use, like peace process and terrorism and all this. And I couldn't help, when I was reading it, I couldn't help but think back to a talk that Noam Chomsky gave a couple of decades ago about the fact that people in power use words in different ways than everyone else does. You know, we all understand these phrases like peace process. We understand the peace process is a process that leads to peace. But that's not the way that's used by people in power. What they mean by peace process is whatever the U.S. happens to be doing, whatever the U.S. happens to be proposing, that's the peace process. It has nothing to do with whether or not it leads to peace or not. It's not really about that. And Rashid talks about the use of the word terrorism, that in the Middle East, terrorism is something that Arabs and Muslims do. It has nothing to do with anybody else. And so, as we go along with our conversation, I want to sort of get into this. He actually goes through three periods of the history of the relationship between Israel, the Palestinians, and the U.S., beginning with the Camp David Accords, and then the Madrid Peace Conference, and then the Obama period. So as we go on, I'm going to kind of bring this stuff up, but I'm not going to go through all of it now. But as we go along, I'll introduce some of this stuff.
You know, Khalidi himself is a good illustration of the dynamics of the politics around the issue of Israel and Palestine in the U.S. Khalidi, before he became professor at Columbia, was in Chicago, as was Barack Obama, and they were acquaintances in the sort of liberal, progressive community of Chicago, where they were both active. And according to people who know well, Obama had a fairly good understanding of the reality of the Israel-Palestine issue before he began to aspire for national office.
Yeah.
Once he started to run for president, the issue of him knowing Khalidi, having known Khalidi, became a political issue in the campaign, and he had to basically repudiate any connection that he had with Khalidi, even though Khalidi himself is a moderate. He is of Palestinian extraction, but he's a moderate, but a historian, someone who tries to understand the reality, not from a partisan pro-Israel point of view. And so that he himself became someone that Obama had to jettison in order to move in his campaign toward the White House. And it's an illustration of the power and the dynamic of this issue within the sort of political elites, or the controlling elites of our discourse on this issue, and something that we need to understand very well if we're going to have a political effect in changing U.S. policy toward Israel and Palestine. And, by the way, if we're going to succeed in avoiding another big war in the Middle East against Iran, which is Israel's fondest desire at this point, that the U.S. get into a war with Iran, we're going to have to understand the political dynamic of this, because the issue of Iran and the issue of Israel are very closely connected in our sort of political sphere, as many votes in Congress illustrated, and something we could talk about now. It's very relevant, for example, in the current Senate campaign to fill John Kerry's seat. There's a certain dynamic around that issue in Congress that it's worth people knowing about.
Okay, so we'll explain some more about that.
Well, just by way of background, I think I said before that of the minority of people in this country that are very politically active around this issue, the voice of those who are pro-Israel is much louder and much more decisive for a lot of reasons that have to do with the dynamics of our political system, some of the peculiarities of our political system. One is that in an issue where most people either don't know much or don't care much, a minority that is very, very strongly partisan and committed on this issue has an outsized influence. And that describes our situation with regard to Palestine. The majority of people in this country don't know and don't care much about that issue, except that they want the U.S. to stay out of it if possible. But there's a determined and influential minority who is pro-Israel in all circumstances and has a certain weight in our political system, especially since there's no equivalent counterpart on the other side that cares passionately as their number one and central issue about Palestine. And I mention this because it's illustrated a little bit in the current Senate race between Markey and Lynch. Markey, who is progressive on many issues that are important to people in this state, especially liberal, progressive-leaning people, happens to be one of the worst in Congress and one of the worst in our state on the issue of Israel, Palestine, and Iran. Yet, how many people are willing to say, I refuse to vote for him because he's bad on that issue? Very few, I would guess. Whereas on the other side, there's a cadre of pro-Israel people who make it very clear that that's their central and number one issue, and they will never vote for or support a candidate who isn't reliable on that issue. So that's an asymmetry in our politics that favors the pro-Israel side. And until there's an equally strong counterpart that says this is a moral issue, our part, obviously, people who favor justice for the Palestinians and a more even-handed U.S. policy in the Middle East don't have that ethnic connection that many, or religious connection that many pro-Israel people feel, either because they're of Jewish extraction or fundamentalist Christians who have a worldview that sees Israel as something very powerful. We have a moral stance about that, and until we're prepared to say morally that we will not support a candidate who is bad on this issue, who has an immoral stance on this issue, then the asymmetry will always favor the pro-Israel people. And personally, I took a vow, although we often, in our political system, often have to hold our nose and vote for someone who is bad but a lesser evil. Yeah. My personal commitment is that I will not vote for a candidate who is noticeably bad, worse than typical on this issue.
What is his
Markey
view?
Is.
What is his view, and how has he expressed it? How do you know?
Of course, in some cases it's a matter of what people express. In other cases, it's about what legislation they support and vote for. There happen to be a number of bills in Congress right now that relate to Israel and the Iran issue in particular, in which Markey is a co-sponsor, one of the small number of co-sponsors. One is a bill, I think it's House Bill 840, which essentially says that we should declare Israel our closest ally and support them in any circumstances, including if they get in a war with Iran. And Markey is one of 3 co-sponsors in this state out of 9 Congress people. The other 2, by the way, are Keating, your congressperson, and Kennedy, who took Barney Frank's seat. Barney Frank was always a certain vote for anything that was in the interest of Israel. Sure. And Kennedy, as a freshman, and this is very important, as a new congressman, since not voting the right way in Israel is considered politically dangerous, the default for a new congressman is always to be, to vote whatever the Israel lobby wants. And Kennedy, in this case, is doing that. He doesn't have any particular history on this issue, but his default on this issue is WWBD, what would Barney do? And Barney Frank was always an absolutely secure vote for anything that the Israel lobby wanted, and Kennedy is taking that view. So that's an example of Markey. I mean, the bar is pretty low, right? There are only a small number of people in Congress who are willing to stand up overtly against the pro-Israel lobby. But Markey on this issue, on that issue, that bill is worse than average. He's also co-sponsored another bill to increase the sanctions against Iran. Also another bill written by AIPAC. Every March, AIPAC has a big national congress in Washington and has its legislative bills, that it desires come out of that. And that's what these 2 bills are. They're AIPAC written bills. And of the second one, which declares, basically effectively declares economic war against Iran, Markey is one of 2 co-sponsors from our state. Markey and Keating, I should say, for those on. So these are votes that are essentially doing what AIPAC and the Israel lobby demands, and essentially putting the desires of the Israel government above the needs and opinions of their own constituents. I mean, I think if there were a poll on the Cape or in Massachusetts in general, people are very leery and very, very unwilling to enter another big war in the Middle East, particularly in favor of Israel. And even though there's a lot of sympathy. I mean, the polling is confusing. Again, on an issue where people mostly don't care. For instance, a poll just came out that the pro-Israel people in the Israeli press trumpeted a lot that showed that favorable sentiment toward Israel was the highest it's been in many years in the United States. The question was, do you feel favorably toward Israel or toward the Palestinians? And, you know, a kind of meaningless sort of question. And on this, 3 times as many people said they were friendly to Israel than friendly to the Palestinians. So, not surprising. It would be very peculiar if there was any other result, given the history, But when they ask people in other kinds of polls, should we side with the Israelis or with the Palestinians or stay neutral, the big majority always says stay neutral, stay out of it. And there's never been a poll, to my knowledge, there should be, there's never been a poll, to my knowledge, that asks people, are you or are you not in favor of more than $3 billion a year in foreign aid to Israel every year?
That'd be a good one.
Especially when, you know, we're cutting back. You know, we have, you know, a budget stalemate, which is leading to a sequester. Most people don't know about it.
That's right.
And of those who know about it and care about it, the overwhelming majority is for it. So we have to talk about these issues. If it was up for a vote, and it's very quiet, this aid for Israel passes very quietly every year. It's not a big issue. But if it ever came public and people knew about it, I think a majority would be against it. Not out of hostility to Israel, but just saying, why are we paying for Israel's defense when they're a relatively prosperous country, and poor people are starving? We're giving the biggest amount of foreign aid of any country to Israel, while elsewhere people are, you know, in dire poverty and are not getting aid. So I think the majority of people would be against it if it were a public issue. But it's always dealt with quietly, sort of under the radar. And that's the way the pro-Israel people like it, because they don't want people to discuss this issue.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that anything to do with Iran right now is very, very important, because if we were to go to war with Iran, that would just be such a total disaster for the entire world. And I have to say that all during Bush's second term, I just kept reading progressive after progressive predicting that we were going to war, we're going to wage war against Iran, all this, and I never believed it for a second. And in fact, it turns out that Bush actually stood up to Israel with regard to going after Iran. But with Obama, I don't have that confidence at all. I really don't.
And you're wise not to have that confidence. I mean, Obama is trying to play a very delicate game of not contradicting Israel directly, but also trying to avoid being drawn into a war. And it's a very dangerous kind of game because it's unstable. He's not willing, and of course, hardly any politician in the United States is willing to say, look, we will not start a war against Iran at the request of Israel, which is really the question that's out there.
Yeah.
The Israelis have succeeded. They played a big role in leading up to the war with Iraq. Israel and its pro-Israel people. You know, you could argue how decisive it was, but Israel and their supporters in the United States were very pro-war in the lead up to the Iraq war 10 years ago. And once Iraq has been eliminated as a potential enemy of Israel, the next big potential enemy is Iran. And they have an interest, to my mind, the nuclear issue is a kind of fake. Everybody knows it's U.S. policy and Israeli policy that Iran not have a nuclear weapon, right or wrong. They could not develop a nuclear weapon clandestinely without anyone knowing about it. They're under inspection. Their nuclear facilities are under inspection all the time. So the Israelis know this. The U.S. government knows it. And then you have to wonder, well, why are we still talking about the threat of an Iranian weapon and why we have to, you know, raise every issue on the table? The reason is because Iran is a competitor of Israel in the Middle East, an opponent of Israel, and Israel would like to see them overthrown the way we overthrew it, and they'd love to see us do it rather than themselves. And that's really what this whole issue is about, and I think most Americans don't understand it. If they did, they would be very, very opposed to it. I mean, the people in this country, after some very hard lessons, have taken the position that we don't need any more wars. I mean, I think the politics of the Middle East are complicated in a lot of ways, but I think there's an overwhelming feeling, even among the conservatives, that we can't start any more wars in the Middle East. And if people understand who's driving for war in the Middle East and why, I think we would, a lot of people would open their eyes about this issue, about our relationship with Israel and what it does for and to the United States.
I think one way we could prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which I believe Iran has suggested, is to say that the Middle East is a nuclear-free zone.
Oh, sure.
And they have suggested
That's a subject that can't come up, though. You know,
every country in the Middle East except Israel is on record in favor of the Middle East being a nuclear weapons-free zone.
Yeah.
And of course, this is an issue which you hardly hear about in this country.
No.
There was supposed to be, this spring, there was supposed to be a conference, an international conference in Helsinki, promoting the concept of a nuclear weapons-free Middle East. And the U.S. and Israel essentially vetoed it, so that it wouldn't happen, because it would be embarrassing. Because as we know, the only nuclear weapons in the Middle East are in the hands of Israel and the U.S. fleet that is in the Persian Gulf and based in Bahrain. So if we care about nuclear non-proliferation, we would be pursuing this avenue.
But we do care, don't we?
Well,
no, I don't think
it depends on who we is.
I don't think we do, really. I mean, I don't think the government really does. I mean, first of all, it would seem to me that if you wanted to stop Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, you would try to convince them that they don't need a nuclear weapon. You know, that we would not be, you know, almost every week there's some congressman in Congress that gives some sort of speech about going after Iran, you know. And this would be exactly the worst way to go. If you want to convince a country not to develop nuclear weapons, and yet you're threatening to go to war with them. I mean, what the third world has learned is that if you want to stop a U.S. invasion, you know, you develop nuclear weapons. That's what you do, you know. And so if you want to stop a country from developing nuclear weapons, and you want to convince them that it really isn't necessary, that we don't mean you any harm, you know, but we're moving completely in the opposite direction.
Or you would support this movement for a nuclear weapons-free Middle East,
Absolutely.
which the U.S. has opposed. So the we is, yes, we three and many people watching at home are in favor of nuclear non-proliferation in general, but we, the U.S. government, is not in favor of nuclear non-proliferation.
The other thing is, there's a little bit of history to this, is that governments really don't pay much attention to their own defense, really. I mean, other than to use it when they're trying to convince the public. Here's an interesting little anecdote: is that Chomsky looked at what happened after the Second World War. You know, the U.S. came out of the Second World War. We had half of the world's wealth. We controlled both oceans. We controlled both sides of both oceans. We had no enemies in sight. There's been nothing like it in history. And you would have thought that they would have done something about the one thing that was coming up over the horizon, and that was the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles. We knew that was coming. We had them. Nobody else had them. And he looked through the declassified record to try and find some sign there was any discussion of this at the highest levels, and he couldn't find a thing. There's absolutely nothing. And I think that tells you a lot.
Yeah, so I mean, if we had a consistent policy opposing the spread of nuclear weapons that we applied even-handedly around the world, we would have opposed Israel's acquisition of nuclear weapons, we would have opposed Pakistan's acquisition of nuclear weapons, and we would oppose India's acquisition of nuclear weapons. All of those countries are U.S. allies, and therefore, whether we particularly wanted them to or not, we didn't make a stink about them becoming nuclear powers. You know, Israel today is a close U.S. ally. Pakistan and India are important allies and trading partners. So, all this focus on Iran, which has declared it is not pursuing a nuclear weapon. You can believe it or not, but the reality is we have important intelligence resources in Iran that say they do not have an active nuclear weapons program. They do have a civilian nuclear weapons program, which is guaranteed by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which we're a signatory to. Israel is not, and Iran is a signatory to. Israel is not, by the way. So if we were serious about nuclear non-proliferation, we would have a principle that says we're opposed to it wherever it happens, not to say we're only opposed to it with countries that we don't like, and we're in favor of nuclear proliferation with countries we do like. That's the U.S. stance. And outside of this country, the whole world understands that that is a hypocritical, politically partisan kind of view that's not going to be successful. Tomorrow we could be convening a conference to remove nuclear weapons from the Middle East tomorrow. As I said, every country, including Iran, has endorsed this concept. Only Israel and the United States are opposed. So if we cared about nuclear weapons proliferation, we, meaning our government, this is the way we would be pursuing it, not the way we're doing it now.
And there's also a certain arrogance behind it all, is that we're allowed to have nuclear weapons. Israel's allowed to have nuclear weapons, but a country we don't like isn't allowed to have them. And actually back when the Shah was running Iran, we were looking for ways to help him get nuclear weapons, you know. So it all depends on.
Well, another illustration is, you know, I'm not in favor of you know, nuclear proliferation, obviously, no. but you know, North Korea actually has demonstrated that it has nuclear weapons. Yet, you know, despite all the tensions, there's not daily talk about bombing North Korea. You know, it may happen without the talk. But whereas Iran, which is an enemy in a different way, especially an enemy of Israel, has a civilian nuclear program that may sometime in the future lead to them having a weapons capability. They talk every week. A week doesn't go by without some threat to bomb or attack Iran from the U.S. or from Israel. And yet North Korea actually has a weapon. And, you know, we don't like it, but we're not threatening
They're threatening
war.
to bomb us.
So it's a good illustration that the issue with Iran is not primarily about nuclear weapons. It's about competition in the Middle East.
Well, I think there are a couple of other things going on, and not so much from Israel's standpoint, but from the U.S.'s standpoint. I think, for one thing, Iran is a country, very much like China, that can't be told what to do. And the U.S. thinks it runs the world, and people are supposed to take orders from us. And these people cannot be ordered around, and I don't think they like that. And I also think that the U.S. needs enemies in the world. I mean, that's the way that we are able to convince the public that we have to have this huge Pentagon budget, you know, is because we have all these enemies in the world. I did want to mention something coming back to, am I pronouncing his name right? Rashid? We just wanted to come back to, he was saying that it was actually France that helped Israel develop the nuclear weapons. Is that correct?
Well, up until 1967, France was the biggest military arms supplier to Israel. And France also had its own independent nuclear weapons project in the early 60s. But Israel was also helped clandestinely by supporters in the U.S., and it's a huge scandal. But apparently, Israel was able to divert, that is steal, divert is a polite word for it, to steal weapons-grade uranium from the United States, and that was part of its early development of nuclear weapons. But France, until 1967, France was Israel's biggest military supporter. In the fighter bombers that Israel flew in 1967 were French Mirages, not F-16s that they fly today.
Okay, and he also talked about, he thinks that Middle East politics, until the Soviet Union came apart, was sort of colored by the Cold War, and that Israel was a great beneficiary of the Cold War.
I think that's true. You know, the way things broke down in the Middle East, that if you were an Arab nationalist, you tended to look to the non-aligned movement and to Soviet arms as your backstop. Whereas, you know, I'm talking about Nasser and, you know, the Egyptians, the Iraqis and so on, not the Gulf countries, which were always sort of U.S. allies, but the Arab nationalist movement, which was anti-Israel and became anti-U.S., relied on the Soviet Union. So the Cold War breakdown, we had Israel and Saudi Arabia. The Russians, they had everybody else. So the Cold War was a big part of the Cold War battleground was in the Middle East, and it was one of the reasons why we supported Israel militarily so strongly in the 70s in particular, 70s and 80s.
Yeah, that brings up something else. I remember Noam Chomsky saying that up until the Six-Day War in '67, American intellectuals really didn't pay very much attention to Israel. It was the '67 war that changed everything. That's when the great love affair took place. And his explanation for it was that you have to take a look at what we were doing in 1967. We were having a hard time putting down the Third World insurrection in Southeast Asia. And the Israelis come along and they show you how you do it, how you really sort of knock them in the head, you know. And furthermore, the Israelis were able to do this while portraying themselves as victims at the same time. And that's how it all sort of came together, and suddenly American intellectuals, including Jewish intellectuals, but not exclusively Jewish intellectuals, but the whole intellectual community, among liberal intellectuals, after the '67 war, that's when their love affair began with Israel.
That sounds awfully cynical.
Well,
that doesn't mean it's not true.
What do you think? Tell me.
Well, I mean, definitely the dynamic in the 60s and 70s was that the U.S. was opposed to sort of the decolonization and the sort of liberation movements in the Third World. We were beginning to fight in Vietnam. We were France's ally in opposing independence for Algeria. And generally, the worldview was that the emerging liberation struggles in the Third World we saw them as anti-U.S. And therefore, Israel, which was the sort of ultimate example of someone who was putting its boot down on the necks of people who were waging this anti-colonial struggle, seemed to be a natural ally to the U.S. In other words, so that's the background of the Vietnam War, you know, our alliance with NATO and Algeria, our alliance throughout with South Africa, the apartheid regime in South Africa. That was the way the side sort of broke down during that period, in the anti-colonial period. And nationalism was regarded as a threat to the United States. Our policy was to put in compliant dictators wherever we could in the Third World, whether it was Vietnam, Indonesia, Zaire, you know, throughout Latin America in this period. So anyone who was not compliant to the United States was perceived as an enemy. And in 1967, Israel beat 3 of those states that were considered hostile to the United States. So naturally, they were perceived to be of use in the geopolitical struggle, the Cold War then. There was also a kind of moral thing. I mean, we have to remember this a long time ago, right? But public opinion also identified with them. I mean, it wasn't just the sort of big, you know, macro policy at the state level. In our gut, we also sort of had a fear of third world liberation movements and an identification with white people in Europe. And Israel, in this context, was an honorary white country. And so it was perceived as in our camp against, you know, the brown and black people. And frankly, Chomsky has written and other people have written, if you look around the world, Israel actually played a role around the world in those struggles, again, consistently on our side against the liberation of black and brown people. Throughout Africa, they supported the dictators that we supported, and Central America. Sometimes it was more convenient for us to get Israeli military support for really bad actors than to support them directly ourselves. So this was going on all over the world then, up until the 1970s, when Israel helped the apartheid regime in South Africa develop its nuclear weapons program clandestinely, which has been proven. It was a suspicion during the 70s that this was going on, and documents have come out now that prove it. That Israel gave nuclear weapons, basically gave the nuclear weapons know-how to South Africa, apartheid South Africa.
Yeah. And
it was given up, the weapons were given up once a democratically elected government came in the 90s, they gave up their nuclear program peacefully.
Wow.
I remember how concerned people were that will the apartheid regime be willing to give up their power when they have nuclear weapons? You know, what's that going to lead to? That's what was so amazing about how that was done.
And the weapons were supplied by the weapons know-how was supplied by Israel. Even though, I mean, it's one of these ironies. Even though by the late 70s and 80s, South Africa was so isolated and so hated for its apartheid system that even as Israel was supplying weapons to the apartheid regime, they were voting against it in the UN.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So Israel, in a sense, in the 60s and 70s, kind of was the U.S.'s attack dog, both in the Middle East and more broadly, and they were perceived as having a strategic interest for the U.S. Now, with the end of the Cold War, all of that changed, and most political foreign policy realists say that our alliance with Israel is harmful to U.S. interests in the Middle East and larger, because it isolates us. You know, we continually have to defend Israel in the UN, to use our veto power, as we've used dozens of times in the UN to defend Israel, and it actually hurts U.S. diplomacy and U.S. standing in the world. So most people would say that we don't have an advantage supporting Israel now. In fact, it's the pro-Israel interest in the U.S. that are compelling us to support Israel, not any sort of diplomatic, military advantage that we might get out of it.
Dianne, you want to jump in here?
Well, in fact, I think that many people think it's to our disadvantage to support Israel now. Even well, because we're making 9/11 is an example of people that attacked the United States, and they've even mentioned Palestine and Palestinians in that attack.
Was that really serious, though? Do you think bin Laden really cared about Israel?
Yes.
I do.
I mean, it may not have been the top issue, but it was consistently mentioned as an issue that that they cared about. Just as the Iranians do. You know, again, reasons of state, it may not be their number one issue, but it's an important issue throughout the Arab world. And in fact, as the people in the Arab world get more of a say in their own governments and their own national policies, sort of opposition to Israel is getting stronger in the Middle East, because we supported a series of sort of authoritarian or dictatorial regimes that actually were more, because of U.S. pressure, were more pro-Israel than their people were. So Egypt is a prime example. I mean, now that there is a movement in the direction of greater democracy in Egypt, Egypt is a less reliable partner for Israel than it was in the past. And other changes in the Arab world are in the same direction. Tunisia was a reliable Arab ally of Israel until they had their Arab Spring, and you could go through the list. Public opinion in the Middle East is strongly anti-Israel because of what Israel did to the Palestinian Arabs, and consequently tends to be strongly anti-U.S.
I wonder if we will have trouble maintaining, I mean, it's very strong now, maintaining our view that that Hamas is a terrorist organization, when people realize that it's basically the same government that is now in Egypt. It's the Islamist government.
I think the Hamas thing is kind of interesting, because it really comes back to the business about language again,
Yes.
I mean, because we talk about democracy and free elections and all that sort of stuff. Well, guess what? These people held a free election, and there were people from around the world that were there to make sure that it was a free election. Jimmy Carter was one of them. He was there for it. But guess what? The wrong people won, and that's another example of the way in which people in power here, they think a free election is an election when our people win.
Right.
And if our people don't win, then it's not really a democratic election.
And but conversely, we think it's terrorism if people we don't like use violence or resist violently.
Oh, yeah.
We think it's justified if we or our friends use violence. And
exactly.
Terrorism is one of these words that has ceased to have any real meaning in the sort of objective world. Terrorism means those people we don't like, what they do. Yeah. And when we commit, or our allies commit, terrorism that's much worse than any terrorist has done, we don't call it terrorism. While I was on my way down here, I was listening on the radio to someone giving an interview about the invention of napalm, which was invented at Harvard University, by the way, during the Second World War. And no one imagined calling the use of napalm in the Second World War. By Vietnam time, some people were starting to think about it. But in the Second World War, when we firebombed the city of Tokyo and killed more people than we did in Hiroshima or Nagasaki, this was napalm that was used. And nobody imagined calling that terrorism at the time, although it killed many more people than any terrorist ever did. So it's a meaningless term, but it's a term that has power, right? It scares people,
right?
But it's an expression of political hypocrisy and not anything objective.
Okay. There's just so much that Khalidi talks about. There's one thing in particular. This is about the negotiations that took place after the Madrid conference, and the fact that the U.S. had made
the Madrid conference in '91. Maybe some of your
they had
viewers
made
might not know about
the U.S.
that.
had made guarantees to the Palestinians that the Israelis would not develop any more settlements while the negotiations were going on, and East Jerusalem would be decided at a later date. And Israel went back on that, and they closed down East Jerusalem and they started up new settlements. And the U.S. realized they weren't going to be able to give the Palestinians any guarantees, and the advisors to the Palestinians at the conference told them that their advice was that they should just leave and refuse to have anything to do with them. And Arafat and the people around him decided against that. And it was sort of like downhill from there. But what they landed up with was the eventual wording that they agreed on, and it shows how language works. It reads, jurisdiction of the Council will cover West Bank and Gaza Strip territory except for issues that will be negotiated in the permanent status negotiations. The two sides view the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as a single territorial unit whose integrity will be preserved during the interim period. This was negotiated between Israel and the Palestinians without the U.S., and the U.S. was very upset at the fact that they had gone off and done this on their own. But what Khalidi is saying is, he says the phrase, except for issues that will be negotiated in the permanent status negotiations, had only one meaning in the Israeli lexicon. Settlements, military installations, land, and much else that were considered by them as the final status issues which were excluded from the purview of the Palestinian Authority's jurisdiction. This is just what Begin had demanded at Camp David. The Declaration of Principles therefore amounts to a capitulation to a key Israeli demand, disguised in innocent-sounding terminology.
Well, and of course, this was the origin of the peace process, which has been going on for almost 25 years now, during which Israel has continued to expand its colonization of the West Bank, maintain its stranglehold around Gaza. And I think it's safe to say that although Israeli politicians continue to talk about the two-state solution, what they have in mind is not two states as the world understands it. They have in mind Israel controlling the whole territory of Palestine, and within that, some Palestinian reservations, Indian reservations for the Palestinians. This is the two-state solution that the Israelis are talking about, and that's never changed during all these negotiations, during over 20 years of negotiations. There's never been an Israeli government that has been willing to envision a sovereign, independent Palestinian state not under the control of Israel in the West Bank and Gaza. And they have done everything they can to make sure that that never happens. And of course, they've succeeded.
Rashid says it actually goes back to Begin, because that's exactly what Begin had insisted take place. And that's the way it's been ever since.
But do you think the U.S. accepts that?
Yeah, they've had to.
Do you think so?
I mean, the U.S. doesn't want it. I think probably U.S. policy has been consistent in preferring a real two-state agreement in which the Palestinians accept their mini-state in the West Bank and Gaza, and Israel keep most of the territory. But they are not willing to confront any Israeli government to bring that about. And the only way, and not only that, at every point where Israel demands that we support them in opposing the actual establishment of a Palestinian state, we comply, including votes and vetoes in the UN. So, yeah, the U.S. would prefer a more compliant Israel, but when push comes to shove, we're not going to oppose them and use any leverage against them. And unless that happens, there'll never be a sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. And that's the situation that the Israelis prefer, an indefinite peace process with no Palestinian state and no peace, because it doesn't cost them much. We pay, the international community pays for the cost of their occupation. We have their back politically and diplomatically, and they're thriving. Israel is thriving as they continue to gobble up more land in the West Bank. And that's the status quo. And until getting back to the politics, until we find a way to oppose the current policy and the political force in the United States that are demanding this policy, it won't change. And until we change our policy in this country, there will never be freedom for the Palestinians. And the U.S. will probably be constantly at war in the Middle East, sort of defending this policy, depending on our alliance with Israel and the oppression of the Palestinians. That's what has to change.
So, okay, so why don't we talk about how we accomplish that? What is it that we can do to begin to turn things around?
Well, I mean, I can speak personally. If this is a moral issue, and to me it is a moral issue, that a politician who endorses the oppression of the Palestinians on behalf of Israel, who endorses U.S. hostility and potential war against Iran, will not get my vote. And I think more people need to say that outright. It may be that such a politician is better in all kinds of ways than some other politician, but if we look at this as a moral and political issue and make it known that we're voting this way, that'll begin to counterpose a different force to the Israel first lobby in our country. And until politicians know there's a price to pay for endorsing this sort of blanket support for Israel, it's not going to change. So my personal conclusion is I will not vote for a politician who is out front, in favor of our one-sided policy toward Israel and war with Iran. And
I'm with you 100%.
I think that's great. I think we also have to try very hard with our vocabulary to change the dialogue. Like I think the Occupy Wall Street really changed the dialogue about wealth in this country. I mean, there was a big fight back. So I think there are a couple of things we can try to change in this Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. One, which you brought up, is the word terrorist. That I don't know if we can make it clear that that doesn't make any sense. But then the other thing is that I heard just on the radio the other day, we have to defend Israel because it's the only democracy in the Middle East. I mean, the word democracy. Can you have a democracy if you have an apartheid state? Can you have a democracy if you have a Jewish state, And what does that mean, a Jewish state? Does that mean a racist state? Does that mean one religion? No freedom of religion.
It's kind of interesting because I figured I wasn't going to be able to get to it, but I did read Peter Beinart's book, The Crisis of Zionism. Peter Beinart's a really committed Zionist.
Right. Yes, I've heard him talk.
But he writes this from the standpoint of a guy who is a Zionist, but he wants to see Israel become a completely democratic state where everyone is equal and everything else. And I'm just wondering if those two are compatible. Is it possible to have a Jewish state and still have everyone treated on an equal term in that state?
Well, what does he mean by a Jewish state? Majority Jewish?
Well, he's talking about, he doesn't actually get into that, but he talks about a real democracy. And what he's saying is that there's a real breakdown in the American Jewish community among younger Jews. And younger Jews will not buy into this business about the Israelis being kind of victims of the world, They're still trying to push. Because they look around them and say, well, we're not victims, we have this fabulous life, But what they are interested in is a country that's a real democracy, where everyone is treated fairly and where everyone has the same kind of break, And that's the kind of thing that he's pushing for. And he says, if we don't do this, then the state of Israel is going to be destroyed.
Yeah, many people say that. In 20 years, there'll be no Israel.
The question I'm raising is it possible, to have that if you have a lot of Arabs in your state whose birth rates are very, very high, and if the time is going to come when there are going to be more Arabs than there are Jews, can you have a Jewish state and still have a totally democratic state the way he defines it?
Well, they aren't letting more Arabs. They are not. They are making it so miserable and denying the Arabs any land, ways of making a living.
But he's opposed to all of that. He doesn't want to see that.
Well, the reality is, both of you need to know that right now, in the land controlled by Israel, which is historic Palestine, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, there most likely is a majority of Palestinians over Jews right now. within the political state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, about a quarter of the people are not Jews. But within Palestine, including the occupied territories, there's probably a slight majority right now of Palestinians who have no rights. So you already have an apartheid regime. You have a regime where a minority of people have a monopoly of political rights, and a majority have few or no political rights. And that's the definition of apartheid as far as I'm concerned. Now, can you have a Jewish state that's Jewish and democratic? I mean, I think to ask the question in our context, think about the United States, is to answer it. Could you have a white and democratic United States? I mean, does anyone believe that is not a ridiculous concept? Could you have a Christian and democratic United States? Some people actually propose that, but I think most of your viewers, wouldn't agree that that's the definition of the United States, particularly those who are not Christian or so.
Even those that are Christian wouldn't.
Yes,
wouldn't
many
agree.
of them.
I mean,
so you can't have a state which is the exclusive property of one religious or ethnic group and not of others. To call that a democracy is out of the question.
Absurd. It's sort of like the Jim Crow South, you know.
Right.
well, but I think there is a difference. I mean, that's the big picture, and you're absolutely right, Jeff. But there is a difference right now in the apartheid within Israel. You know, the Arabs that live there, some of them are Muslims, some of them are Christians. They don't have enough rights that they really can multiply. I mean, their children can't get jobs. They're not allowed to serve in the army, and so therefore they can't get any of the public jobs. So most of them leave, don't they?
Well, it's the desire that they leave. Actually, not as many actually leave as the Zionists would prefer. But that's the plan. Insofar as there's a plan for the long run, you know,
make it
what can you do in the
miserable,
future? It means somehow you have to get rid of the Palestinians. If you're a Zionist and want to have a Jewish state, you have to get rid of the Palestinians.
Well,
how they're going to do that is a whole other.
It's a settler. You know, Israel's founded by a settler culture, as were we. You know, and the ultimate logic of settler culture is the removal of the native population. I mean, that's what happened here. We're sort of coming to the end. Do you want to have any sort of final comments, Jeff?
Well, that just there's a whole other discussion about the nature of Israel and the history of Zionism as a colonial movement, which is worth talking about. But
okay, next time we'll do that. Dianne, any last words?
I don't know about last words. I think education of the U.S., the American people, is very important. I think that your witness of this being a moral issue and not voting for anyone in the United States that doesn't understand this I think that's very important.
Yeah, okay, we're going to have to end it there. No, I agree with that completely. You've convinced me. Thank you very much for being here. Until next time, do whatever you can for peace and social justice. Thank you very much.
Seems to really change people.
I'm interested in the fact that you're able to attract an audience you don't normally attract, because I think that one of the problems that movements have is that you sort of speak to the choir. You know, I mean, when I lived in Dorchester for about 30 years, I must have gone to 10,000 symposiums and stuff, and I just saw the same people every time I went. You know, there were the same people there, and it's just, I think it's a real problem. So the fact that you were able to attract people who don't normally show up at these things is just wonderful. I think that's what needs to happen. Okay.
Yes, I agree, but I don't really know why we did this time.
Okay. Jeff?
And we didn't.
Well, you know, it's an illustration of one of the difficulties of approaching this issue politically in the United States is that most people don't care that much about it. And of those who care about it and know about it, there's a hard core of pro-Israel sentiment that has a political expression that's very powerful in this country, and there's very little counterpart in the other direction that has political weight to have a U.S. policy that's different from the one it has now. And that's the sort of central political difficulty we have. You know, of the politically active class in this country, which is a minority, a small minority actually, pro-Israel sentiment is much better organized and more influential than pro-peace sentiment in the Middle East. And until we figure out how to break through that, or how to sort of grasp the political nut in a different way, it's going to continue to sort of be this asymmetrical pro-Israel stance of our government. And you know, there's a lot of illustrations of that in our sort of some current political examples.
Right. Dianne, you want to jump in here?
Well, I agree with Jeff, and I agree with the problem is reaching people, and we do have a...
Back in the 2008 presidential campaign, he was demonized by both political parties, you know, but the truth is that this is one of the really, really good guys. And when Edward Said died, they created a chair in his name at Columbia, and Rashid is the man they picked to fill that chair. And this book of his is not really so much about what's happened to the Palestinian people. It really is about the U.S. It's about how the U.S. has been undermining any kind of just peace in the Middle East from the very beginning. And a lot of it has to do with language. You know, he begins with, and I want to read this, he begins with this quote from Orwell. And this is the quote from Orwell, from Orwell's the famous essay, Politics in the English Language. The slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should and do know better. And he spends a lot of time talking about the way in which language has been used right from the very beginning. You know, this whole business about the Jews as victims from the Holocaust and all that, that's been used against anybody who dared to criticize the state. And he's also talked about particular kinds of words and phrases that we use, like peace process and terrorism and all this. And I couldn't help, when I was reading it, I couldn't help but think back to a talk that Noam Chomsky gave a couple of decades ago about the fact that people in power use words in different ways than everyone else does. You know, we all understand these phrases like peace process. We understand the peace process is a process that leads to peace. But that's not the way that's used by people in power. What they mean by peace process is whatever the U.S. happens to be doing, whatever the U.S. happens to be proposing, that's the peace process. It has nothing to do with whether or not it leads to peace or not.
Yeah.
It's not really about that. And Rashid talks about the use of the word terrorism, that in the Middle East, terrorism is something that Arabs and Muslims do. It has nothing to do with anybody else. And
support WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and our committee is the West Asia Group, and then there's Code Pink, Jewish Voice for Peace, Mecca, If Americans Knew, Palestinian Chronicle. And I think that we have a conference on Cape Cod, the Tree of Life Conference, and a journey, the Tree of Life Journey, which goes to Israel and Palestine. And the conference, which is always in the fall, in October and November, brings people from Israel and Palestine over, and we try to get as many people as we can and educate them. And then during the year, we also have speakers. March 23rd, we had Maya Wind and Aaron Efrati speak in Orleans, and the Refused Nick and the Soldier, and that talk brought in a different audience than before. A very,
that's interesting.
Yeah, a very intelligent, reasonable, but skeptical Jewish audience. And they asked very good questions, and they seem to really have learned a lot from these two young people who are Jewish, grew up in Jerusalem, and one, Maya, 26, has refused to serve in the armed services. She refused 3 times, went to jail for 40 days each time, and went before the judges, the generals, trying to get a conscientious objector status, and was told political reasons are not good reasons for a conscientious objector status. And Aaron Afradi was a soldier, and after he got out, he joined Breaking the Silence and told some horrifying stories about what took place, especially in Hebron. So this kind of speaker.
Welcome to another edition of Talking Together. I'm Richard Sentner. With me today are Jeff Klein and Dianne Ashley. I want to thank you both for being here. The title of today's show is The Fateful Triangle and the Quest for Just Peace. Back in 1983, Noam Chomsky wrote this book called The Fateful Triangle, the U.S., Israel, and the Palestinians. And that triangle he was talking about is very much alive and going today. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the possibilities for peace, and we're also going to talk about the impediments to it. So, Dianne, you want to start us off?
Well, I think that the topic was what we in the United States can do towards peace.
Okay.
And so I was just going to say all the things that I think we need to do. I think that we have been struggling against a political situation with President Obama and members of Congress that are not doing anything helpful. And I think that many of them know what the situation is, but they're not doing anything. So my approach is to work with the grassroots, to work educating the people and get them to try to move their Congress people to do more. And I have a lot of different ways to do that, but I think maybe we might want to talk more about the political situation.
Well, why don't you start off by telling us just a few of the ways that you think.
Okay. Well, there are a lot of good organizations that we need to film series on Cape Cod, Channel 99, the local channel, where every Saturday, 4 to 5, we show 9 different films. One of them we made right here with Jeff. That was the first one. Remember that?
Yes.
I remember that.
And then we have one with Howard Zinn. And we also have the play, The Words of Rachel Corrie, but we've added 3 new ones, which are just made in the last few years. Budrus.
Yeah, why don't you hold that up?
About a town in the West Bank that was, they were building the wall, the security wall, so-called security wall or separation wall, right through this town, and the people organized peacefully. And finally, it was the women that finally won the battle to move the wall. It's a small battle just away from, just off of Palestinian land to the border between Israel and Palestine. That was the great victory that they had, but it's all about how many different ways they tried. And then The Land Speaks Arabic. I've been somewhat surprised at how many people, we've shown this also at First Parish Brewster, but it's also now on our TV program, and it's about what happened in Israel and Palestine between 1945 and 1954. So it's all about the background.
Okay. As we go along, I want to talk a bit about this book by Rashid Khalidi called The Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Undermined Peace in the Middle East. I read it last night. My good friend John Amir gave this to me. And I want to explain to the audience a little bit about Rashid because I think it's important.